make work pay, make access to the goods that we need in society more equitable and cheaper for everyone by universalising some of the access to those. And then I think also tackle particularly some of the accumulation of wealth that is not productive, just giving private dividends to a small group of people in society. Income from work is growing much slower than income from wealth. And that is a fundamental break in the social contract. So the social contract says the harder you work, you can get on and you can rise up the social ladder. If you work really hard and you do the right things, you'll be rewarded. And what this is showing is that the best way to climb and maintain your position up the social ladder is to inherit wealth. And that wealth is concentrated amongst a small group in society. And it means no matter how much, if you're from a working class background with no inheritance, no matter how hard you work, you're going to struggle to catch up with those people who've inherited wealth from their parents or their family. And that's a real break in our social contract and in what we think of as a good society. And it's a real challenge to this concept of social mobility. Because unless we can break that link a bit with wealth and opportunity, we're basically locking a huge number of people out of that opportunity in the future.
And where are they inheriting that wealth from? Is it cash or is it assets?
So it's a lot of things, but the biggest thing that's changed over the last few decades has been housing wealth. That is the biggest thing that's driving that increase in wealth in society. So for example, wages over the last few decades have doubled, but housing wealth has tripled. And so a lot of that is inheritance of housing. And whereas originally we would have had maybe 7 in 10 people who owned, or families who owned their properties, that's now declining and has been declining for the last few decades, which means less and less people are benefiting from owning a house and inheriting a house.
And how many people are getting onto the housing ladder now? Has that stagnated, to ask you the most obvious question?
Yes, it has stagnated. So if you look at the last century, we basically went from around 2 in 10 up to about 7 in 10 people owning their properties. We've since the 1990s that's been declining, and so increasingly you find, particularly amongst younger generations, that the aspiration of owning your own home is just completely out of reach. More and more people in the rented sector, with very expensive rents, a lot of insecurity, or even worse, having to stay with their family when they would have been moving out. And so you have also this phenomenon of the kind of delayed adulthood, where people aren't actually moving out, getting their own home, starting a family until much later in life because they can't afford to do so.
That growing rental class, what's that doing to class at large?
I mean, what it's essentially doing is making a bigger divide between the haves and the have-nots. It's meaning that if you're not from a family with housing wealth or wealth at the start of your life, it's very likely that that's going to hurt your life chances in general. So people with families without housing wealth, less likely to go into higher education, less likely to earn higher salaries, less likely to own the house themselves in the future. And so we're just getting this kind of twin economy with two different sets of life chances for two different sets of people.
The report talks about good wealth and bad wealth. What's the distinction or the difference between the two of those?
So there are lots of, we should be aspiring to having a wealthy society. That's a good aspiration to have. And there are lots of elements of our wealth that we might want to increase. We have natural assets, the nature and the world we live in, which we should be wanting to conserve and expand. Health is you can think of health as a form of asset and wealth. And there are also kind of new housing, that expands the opportunity for wealth, or creation of new businesses, R&D that creates new intellectual property. These are all things that are productive. They create more wealth and health and happiness in society. There are then things that are basically where we've inflated the price of assets, so people are gaining wealth out of nothing to do with increasing productivity or increasing the kind of productive potential of society, but where we're just giving kind of one-off windfalls to certain groups of people. So the fact that our property prices have gone through the roof is because we've turned housing into a speculative asset. Some people who own a house benefit from that. It's not really to do with their hard work. Obviously, they might have had to work hard originally to get on the ladder, But the reason why my parents have gone from being working class to middle class, and why they bought their house was in the tens of thousands of pounds that they would have paid for it, and it's now worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. The main thing that's changed over that period is not that they've done some amazing thing to the house to make it worth more. It's that we've financialised our economy and pumped ever more money into a set number of houses in certain areas, and that's inflated the value of those houses, and people have a small group of people have benefited from that. And made it ever harder for anyone else to get on the property ladder. So unless we tackle some of those challenges, we're going to see social mobility decline and opportunity for large swathes of society locked up.
And how do you start tackling?
So the report that we put out this week says there are broadly 3 things that we can do. One is we can share wealth. If you go back to New Labour, one of the things they did was create something called the Child Trust Fund. That would give every young child a small inheritance. It was just over £1,000, I think, originally. But everyone would get that inheritance as a kind of right of citizenship. And it would mean that everyone has the potential to start saving and accumulating, for example, towards either an education or a house over time. So that's about trying to share the opportunity of wealth more widely. And there have been bigger proposals for much bigger sums of money. Obviously, you've got to find that revenue from somewhere. So maybe it's a tax on wealth that's then redistributed across society to younger generations.
Can I pause you there and can I ask you, I mean, the minute that you say tax on wealth, I imagine a lot of people panic. What would that look like?
So there are 2 things you can do. One is you can tax the income from wealth. So at the moment, if I, as I do, earn my income from labour, I will pay whatever it is, 50p on the pound, whatever it is, my income, national insurance. If you add national insurance, if I were to earn that from renting a second property or from stocks and shares, I would pay nothing near that amount on that income that comes from that. And there's no legitimate reason why that inequality exists. It's a historical inequality and an unfairness in our tax system that means that if you own assets, you don't have to pay as much on the income from those assets. So that's one thing you could do. The second thing is you could tax the assets themselves, so not the income that comes from it, but when you sell a house, a stamp duty, for example, or so there are those 2 things. I think the thing to bear in mind here is that, and there's another astonishing fact that the report highlights, which is that despite the fact that over the last few decades that wealth has increased massively, the share of our tax revenue, share of our GDP coming from wealth taxation has not gone up. So the tax system is not keeping up with the change in our economy. So I think we could over time look at how we could tax those assets more and tax the income from those assets more. That would probably target a very small share of the population, but help to distribute the gains from that across society for everyone. So if you take, for example, the farmers' protests last week, it's a vanishingly small number of farms that policy is going to hit. I mean, there are some numbers which suggest that last year it would be 115 farms that were above the £2.5 million threshold, £3 million threshold that they're talking about. So it's a very small group in society that we're asking to contribute a bit more because they have gained from this inflation of wealth and assets in order to ensure that everyone has a decent chance in life to get on and succeed.
The problem though is that was wildly unpopular. So how would the sort of wealth tax that you're speaking about here, a wider tax on assets, surely that wouldn't be received too positively? I'm
sure there will be groups in society who don't want that tax to happen because it's a disadvantage to them. But they are relatively small groups in society, and we live in a democracy where we want everyone to be able to thrive and everyone to be able to succeed, and sometimes that means people with the broadest shoulders contributing more. And so far we've asked people who are earning their income from work to do that, but we're not asking the same amount from people that are earning their income from wealth and who own assets. This report doesn't just talk specifically about wealth tax, though. It offers a broader range of ideas around the actual taxation on assets. And can you talk me through a couple of those? Yeah, so I think the other thing that we should be doing is thinking, because we've had this massive increase in wealth, we should be trying to tackle that, but that's a huge task. It's going to take a long time. So we should also be thinking about how do we make it more comfortable for people who don't have wealth to live a really happy, successful life. So a few examples of how we might think about that. You could find ways of universalising the cost of, for example, childcare or social care, which would mean that those who don't have assets to pay for those things, particularly things like social care, the state can step in and support to ensure that everyone has a decent access to social care. Housing would be another example. You know, we could build more social housing. So if you can't save up, there is more affordable housing on the market. We've lost a massive stock of that social housing, and that means that so many people are now forced into the private rented market. Or we could make private renting cheaper, more secure, so that your quality of housing doesn't entirely depend, and your security of housing doesn't entirely depend on your ability to save up and buy a house or inherit one. And then the final thing I think we should think about is how we make work pay, so that gap between the amount that wages have gone up and that wealth is going up is narrowed. And so you've seen the government, for example, recently put in place new legislation on making work pay and workers' rights, and that's to try and correct this imbalance, which has meant that so many people, their wages haven't gone up in the last few decades, even as, for example, companies make reasonable profits. So make work pay, make access to the goods that we need in society more equitable and cheaper for everyone by universalising some of the access to those. And then I think also tackle particularly some of the accumulation of wealth that is not productive, that is not creating a more productive economy, is just giving private dividends to a small group of people in society.